Thank you, Madam Speaker. As the humanitarian catastrophe continues to unfold in Gaza, I rise tonight to follow up on the many times I've called for this government to advocate for a ceasefire, beginning on October 8th and numerous times in the House in the weeks after. Now, after months of pressure from Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian Canadians across the country, first this government's position on a ceasefire changed at the UN just before the holidays, and then various ministers and then the Prime Minister began to finally say the word ceasefire in recent months. This pressure included protests, sit-ins, meetings with MPs, Muslim donors revoking their financial support, and the National Council of Canadian Muslims turning down a scheduled in-person meeting with the PM last month. While it never should have taken months to simply call for a ceasefire, this government's changed position makes clear that people power has an impact. In the meantime, it's worsening. Since October 7th, almost 30,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including at least 10,000 children. And what makes no sense at all is how this government claims to support a ceasefire, but isn't taking positions that would align with that call. This government must, at the very least, align their actions with their call for a ceasefire. And with the limited time I have tonight, I'd like to give just 3 examples. First, they must refund the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, or UNWRA for short. Last week, the Minister of International Development was at the Rafah gates calling for a ceasefire with supposed concern about aid not getting into Gaza. Yet he is the minister responsible for defunding UNWRA. 2 million people in Gaza rely on UNWRA for life-saving humanitarian aid, including food, water, and medicine. And this was cut after 12 employees out of 13,000 were alleged to be associated with Hamas. All 12 of those have been fired, and CBC has reported that these claims were made by Israel without any supporting evidence. If this government is serious about a ceasefire, UNWRA must be refunded. Secondly, if they're serious about a ceasefire, they must also call for Israel to follow the International Court of Justice ruling calling for 6 steps to be taken to prevent genocide. Over a month since the ruling, Amnesty International has made clear that Israel has failed to take even the bare minimum steps to comply with the ruling. Canada is a signatory to the Genocide Convention, and so we are bound by this ICJ decision. In other jurisdictions around the world, for example in Ukraine, Canada is vocal in calling for a rules-based order to be followed. Why is it not doing so when it comes to what may be a genocide in Gaza? Finally, if they're serious about a ceasefire, this government must end permitting of military equipment destined for Israel. Global Affairs has revealed that this government has authorized at least $28.5 million of new permits for military exports to Israel since October 7th. A coalition of legal advocates has warned it's ready to bring a legal challenge against the federal government if it's failed to halt military sales to Israel. And a coalition of civil society organizations, including Human Rights Watch, Kairos, and the Mennonite Central Committee of Canada, have called for the same. And so my question to the Parliamentary Secretary, if this government claims to finally be in support of a ceasefire, why aren't they taking actions that align with this, like refunding UNWRA, calling for Israel to follow the ICJ decision, and ending all military exports destined for Israel?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We share an immense grief and our heart breaks for the tragic loss of civilian life. All those impacted are at the forefront of our minds, including all families and communities affected by this violence. Children in particular, Madam Speaker, have been disproportionately affected by the ongoing hostilities. The horrific attacks by Hamas against Israeli civilians still shock us all. And Madam Speaker, I surely do remember, because October 7th was the birthday of my 40th anniversary. And we are unequivocally in our condemnation of Hamas' terrorist attack against Israel and the appalling loss of life and the heinous act of violence perpetrated in those attacks. And I do want to thank the member from Waterloo, Kitchener-Conestoga, Kitchener-South Hepler, and Cambridge for advocating for solutions that both respect the Jewish community and the Palestinian community. Canada condemns Hamas' unacceptable treatment of hostages and calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages. And what has been happening in Gaza is catastrophic. With the humanitarian situation in Gaza already dire, the impacts of an expanded military operation in Rafah would be devastating for Palestinian civilians, as well as for foreign nationals who are seeking refuge. They have nowhere else to go, and, as the minister said, asking them to move again is simply unacceptable. The price of defeating Hamas cannot be continued suffering of all Palestinian civilians. And the violence must stop. That is why we have been calling for an immediate and sustainable ceasefire. This cannot be one-sided. Hamas must release all hostages and lay down its arms, and humanitarian aid must urgently be increased and sustained. The need for humanitarian assistance in Gaza has never been greater. Rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian relief must be provided to civilians. Canada will continue to work with its partners towards ensuring the sustained access of humanitarian assistance for civilians, including food, water, medical care, fuel, shelter, and access to humanitarian workers. To date, Canada has announced $100 million in humanitarian assistance to address the urgent needs of vulnerable civilians in this crisis. We are clear that a sustainable ceasefire is necessary to finding a path towards securing lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians. And we have been calling for a ceasefire for 2 months, and we expect every party to join us if they have not done already so. Canada remains steadfast in our commitment to a two-state solution. This means the creation of a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state, where Palestinians and Israelis live side by side in peace, security, and dignity, just like they do in Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker.